I grew up believing that my adoptive mother, Nancy, had rescued me from a life of endless foster homes. She always reminded me how grateful I should be for the roof over my head, the clothes on my back, and the love she said she provided. It wasn't until I met Zach, the man I thought I'd spend the rest of my life with, that I realized exactly how conditional that love truly was. One day before our wedding, Nancy asked me to cancel everything so Zach could marry my stepsister, Evelyn, instead. That was the final straw for me. I never saw it coming. Nancy had always favored Evelyn, her biological daughter, but I believed she still cared for me. I was her adopted child after all, even if not by blood. Evelyn was 2 years younger than me, beautiful in that effortless way that turns heads, and she thrived on attention. I had no idea she'd even been talking to Zach behind my back. But when Nancy confronted me in my living room with her bizarre demand, it all made a twisted sort of sense. They wanted me out of the picture so Evelyn could wear my ring. I felt my stomach twist into knots. All my life, I'd aimed to please Nancy, to earn her approval. I had studied hard to get into college, landed a decent job, and done everything by the book. Evelyn, on the other hand, partied her way through her teenage years, constantly demanded money from Nancy, and never once felt guilty for how she treated me. Yet, Nancy turned to me, the daughter who'd never given her trouble, and expected me to destroy my own happiness for Evelyn's sake. My heart pounded so hard I thought everyone in the room could hear. I asked Nancy why, hoping I might have misunderstood. She gave me a condescending smile, the kind that flickered across her face whenever she thought I was being clueless. She said it was only right that Evelyn get her shot at a stable future, given her missteps. Apparently, it was my duty as the grateful adopted daughter to step aside. Zach, shifting uncomfortably in his seat, wouldn't meet my eyes. He didn't deny anything. He just sat there, looking guilty as sin. I felt rage surge through me, but also profound disbelief. How could they do this to me? I told Nancy that I loved Zach and refused to cancel my wedding. The next thing I knew, she was screaming at me, calling me selfish and ungrateful. She said she had invested so much in me, raised me when nobody else wanted me, and this was how I repaid her. Zach muttered something about needing time to think. Evelyn just stood there with a smug expression, as if she expected Nancy to bully me into submission. I walked out, my hands shaking, tears threatening to fall. I needed to clear my head, but I also knew I needed answers. I drove straight to my best friend Paula's place. She'd been my rock throughout the wedding planning, always the voice of reason. When I told her what Nancy had said, she looked ready to murder someone. Paula thought Nancy and Evelyn were insane and that Zach was a coward for not defending me. She asked if I wanted to walk away from Zach completely. I wasn't sure yet. I needed to confront him and hear his side, but a small voice in my head told me that my relationship with Nancy was beyond repair. Finally, at last, I'd choose myself. Zach came home later that evening. He looked uneasy, pacing around the living room like a caged animal. I asked him point blank if he had feelings for Evelyn. He hesitated, then admitted they'd shared a drunken kiss a few months back. He insisted it was a mistake and that Nancy was blowing it out of proportion. I demanded to know why he didn't stand up for me. He claimed Nancy had cornered him, told him that if he didn't cooperate, she'd cut me off financially. The funny thing was, I was financially independent, so it made no sense at all. I realized Nancy didn't just want Zach for Evelyn. She wanted to humiliate me. Perhaps she thought if she threatened Zach, he'd crumble and I'd be forced to back down. Zach swore he loved me and still wanted to marry me, but I saw doubt in his eyes. That was enough to snap me out of my confusion. I told him that if he truly loved me, he'd cut all contact with Evelyn and stand by me in front of Nancy. He hesitated again, eyes darting to the door. In that moment, I understood. He'd never fight for me, ever. Everything I'd built my life around suddenly seemed like a lie. I told Zach he had until morning to decide where he stood. Then I grabbed my purse, walked out, and drove to Paula's again. That night, I hardly slept, my mind racing with anger and heartbreak. We were set to be married the next day, and I was expected to just vanish so Evelyn could claim my future? My phone buzzed with texts from Nancy, each more manipulative than the last. I didn't open a single one. I knew whatever she said would only make me more furious still. In the morning, Zach sent me a brief text saying he'd chosen me, but only if I apologized to Nancy. That was all I needed to see. I texted him back that the wedding was off, that I refused to start my marriage under Nancy's thumb. Then I blocked his number. I contacted the venue, told them to keep the reservation for now, and asked Paula to gather a few close friends. I had no intention of letting Nancy and Evelyn off the hook. Instead of a wedding, I was going to turn that day into my stage for vengeance. First, I needed to ensure Nancy and Evelyn would show up. Nancy had spent thousands on her dress and the venue's decorations, so I knew she'd still arrive, hoping to twist everything in her favor. I told the wedding planner to confirm with Nancy that the schedule was unchanged. Then I invited Evelyn, letting her believe she'd be taking my place. In truth, I had a plan to expose both of them in front of everyone they hoped to impress. I wasn't sure Zach would show, but I figured Nancy would drag him there, if only to finalize her scheme. That morning, I arrived early. I wore a simple white dress, not the extravagant gown Nancy had pressured me to buy. Paula and our friends helped set the scene. The guests trickled in, many of them oblivious to the drama. I took a deep breath, preparing myself for confrontation. Sure enough, Nancy strutted in like she owned the place, with Evelyn clinging to her arm. Zach trailed behind, looking miserable. Before Nancy could bark orders, I walked to the front, microphone in hand. The hush that fell over the crowd made my heart pound. It was showtime, no turning back. I thanked everyone for coming, then announced that the wedding would not proceed as planned. A ripple of confusion swept through the audience. Nancy started to approach, but I lifted my hand to silence her. My voice shook, but I pressed on. I explained how, just one day prior, Nancy had demanded I call off my wedding so Evelyn could marry Zach. Gasps filled the room. Evelyn stood there, mouth open as if I'd slapped her. Nancy tried to grab the microphone, but Paula stepped forward, blocking her path. Everyone was watching, waiting for me to reveal the rest. Everything. I stated, loud and clear, that this betrayal was the reason I could no longer marry Zach. I turned to him, asking if he had something to say. He stammered, trying to apologize, but the audience was already buzzing with shock and disapproval. He confessed to a moment of weakness with Evelyn. Then, Nancy screeched that I was making a spectacle, that I was ungrateful and determined to ruin my family. I calmly pointed out that Nancy had never considered me real family. I had proof of her texts, outlining how she wanted Zach to dump me for Evelyn. Period. I projected them onto a screen, every manipulative message Nancy had sent to Zach, calling me a charity case, telling him he deserved someone from her bloodline instead. The crowd murmured in disbelief. Evelyn tried to act shocked, but I had texts from her too, bragging about how she and Zach were meant to be. Nancy lunged at me, shrieking that I was destroying the family's reputation. I stepped back, letting security, who Paula had arranged, intervene. The entire room was in chaos. Yet I felt oddly calm, as though I'd finally taken control of my life and my narrative at last. I looked Nancy in the eye and told her I owed her nothing. All my life, she'd held my adoption over my head, expecting endless gratitude. I made it clear that I would not be manipulated anymore. Then I looked at Evelyn, who was practically trembling. She tried to blurt out that Zach loved her, but Zach just hung his head. He tried to approach me, perhaps to beg forgiveness. I turned away. I wouldn't grant him that kindness. He had a chance to defend me, and he didn't. I wanted him to feel every ounce of regret and shame. With the room in disarray, I took one final opportunity to address everyone. I explained how Nancy had belittled me for years, how she'd weaponized my adoption whenever it suited her. I clarified that I was not disowning her. She'd never truly been my mother to begin with. People gawked, but I felt liberation surge within me. I declared that I would no longer be controlled by a woman who valued blood ties over love. Then I thanked those who'd supported me, apologized for the chaos, and announced that the reception would still happen for anyone who wanted to celebrate freedom. Nancy shrieked for everyone's attention, insisting that this was her venue. She demanded they all leave, but the contract was in my name, not hers. Security escorted Nancy outside, though she kept screaming about suing me, about how I owed her for my upbringing. Evelyn trailed behind, calling me every insult under the sun. I laughed, not because it was funny, but because I felt numb to her venom. Zach lingered awkwardly, torn between following Nancy and trying to salvage our relationship. I left him standing there, staring after me as I invited the guests to enjoy the catering inside. Despite the drama, a surprising number of guests stayed. Paula and I turned the ruined wedding into a small celebration of independence. We ate, drank, and shared stories that had nothing to do with Nancy's manipulations. The relief in my chest grew as I realized how many people cared about me, not about Nancy's money or approval. Late in the afternoon, I caught a glimpse of Zach lurking by the entrance, eyes filled with regret. I didn't acknowledge him. My heart felt heavy, but I was resolute. He'd made his choice when he didn't stand up or properly protect me. The next day, I woke up to a flurry of missed calls. Nancy had apparently tried to spin the entire fiasco, telling relatives that I'd gone hysterical and canceled the wedding out of spite. But I'd already posted a video recording of the fiasco on social media, showing Nancy's demands and her meltdown. Public opinion quickly turned against her. Relatives who once saw me as the outsider called to offer apologies. I thanked them, but I had no intention of letting Nancy off the hook. For years, I'd bowed to her. Now she'd taste the consequences of betrayal and manipulation. First, I cut all financial ties. Nancy had used me as a co-signer on some loans for Evelyn's schooling, which Evelyn never finished. I contacted the loan officers and explained the fraud. I had no obligation to continue paying for Evelyn's irresponsible spending. Evelyn was furious, but there was nothing she could do. Nancy tried to threaten legal action, but she had no ground to stand on, especially once I shared evidence of her manipulations. Then I made sure my father's inheritance, left to me before he died, was firmly locked away from Nancy. I refused to bankroll her manipulative games anymore. Next, I confronted Evelyn directly. She had tried to blame Nancy for everything, claiming she never wanted Zach in the first place, but her messages told a different story. She begged me not to ruin her future, insisting she'd learned her lesson. I laughed at the irony. She and Nancy had tried to steal my fiancé, yet she spoke as if I owed her mercy. I warned her that if she continued harassing me or tried contacting Zach again, I'd release all her texts publicly. She sobbed, cursing me for being heartless, but I felt zero remorse for her pain. As for Zach, he showed up at my apartment 2 weeks later, begging for a second chance. He claimed Nancy had coerced him, that he'd been confused by her threats. I reminded him that he was a grown man, free to choose how he reacted. He'd chosen cowardice when I needed him to be strong. He tried to hand me a ring, saying he wanted to propose all over again, properly this time. I tossed it back, telling him I'd never trust him. The pain in his eyes was real, but so was the damage he'd done to me forever. He wrote me letters, left me voicemails, even showed up at my workplace once, begging me to hear him out. I refused. My mind was made up. I wanted him to suffer the consequences of losing me. After all the heartbreak, I chose not to forgive. My life was moving forward, and he was stuck grappling with the fallout of his weakness. Meanwhile, Nancy and Evelyn's reputations were in tatters. People who once admired Nancy's perfect family saw the truth behind her facade. Evelyn couldn't show her face without whispers trailing her. I felt absolutely no pity for them whatsoever. I stayed in contact with a handful of relatives who genuinely cared for me. They were appalled at Nancy's behavior, especially after seeing the video. Though they tried to broker peace, I refused. Nancy had treated me as less than human, and Evelyn had joined in. They deserved no reconciliation. Instead, I poured my energy into therapy, focusing on rebuilding my self-esteem. Paula and my other friends stood by me, celebrating my new chapter. I moved to a new place, one Nancy had no address for, ensuring she couldn't barge in unannounced. Finally, I began to breathe truly freely again. Occasionally, gossip reached me about Nancy and Evelyn. Rumor had it Nancy was selling the house to cover debts, while Evelyn couldn't land a steady job due to her reputation. Zach apparently tried to date Evelyn afterward, but their fling fizzled out under the weight of public scrutiny. Each rumor brought me a strange sense of satisfaction, not because I reveled in their misery, but because I felt validated. Their downfall was the result of their own choices. They tried to destroy me, but I'd survived and grown stronger. Now, they were the ones scrambling to pick up the pieces. I didn't stop there. With the help of a legal advisor, I ensured Nancy couldn't claim any part of my assets. I even found a small clause in the adoption paperwork that specified her financial responsibility for my welfare until I turned 18, something she'd conveniently overlooked while extorting me. Though I wouldn't pursue legal action for past grievances, it felt good to know I had a powerful defense if she tried anything else. I wanted Nancy and Evelyn to understand I wasn't weak anymore. Not anymore. The days of using my gratitude against me were over. I'd found my voice. Some people asked if I regretted exposing them so publicly, suggesting I stooped to their level. Honestly, I felt no guilt personally. They'd given me no mercy when they plotted behind my back. I refused to grant them any courtesy in return. Nancy's social standing crumbled, and Evelyn's hopes of an easy ride vanished. I didn't cheer at their downfall, I merely watched it happen. That was enough. Revenge doesn't always have to be dramatic. Sometimes it's the quiet satisfaction of seeing those who wronged you face the results of their own actions. And that was justice enough for me. I've since created a life that's truly my own. I found a new job in a different city, started volunteering at a local shelter, and made friends who know nothing of my past drama. They see me as I am, a determined, resilient person who stands up for herself. Nancy occasionally tries to contact me, usually around holidays, sending messages about forgiveness and family. I ignore them. She taught me that blood, or an adoptive claim, doesn't grant her the right to dictate my happiness. I won't allow her back in just because she regrets the consequences. My revenge is her absolute irrelevance. Some might say I should seek closure, but I disagree. I don't need their apologies or acceptance. My life has purpose without their validation. I'm sharing this because people often think forgiveness is the only path to healing. It's not. Sometimes justice is standing firm in your decision not to allow toxic people back into your life. They don't deserve your kindness. They deserve to watch you thrive without them. And that, more than anything, is the sweetest revenge I could have imagined. I owe Nancy and Evelyn nothing. I won't forgive. I won't forget. I will only live better now.